So hello and welcome to an ACEN webinar. We're so excited to be bringing this webinar to you today. This one is on WIL and graduate outcomes. And in this webinar, we'll be looking at the WIL items that ACEN sponsored inside the GOS, which is the Graduate Outcome Survey. Now, we've had this survey with these WIL items for the last 2 years, so we're going to be showing you some really cool data today that will actually reflect on the findings from across those 2 years, which is 2020 and 2021. So before we begin, I'd love to start with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge that country for Aboriginal people is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. Wherever you are located in Australia today, we acknowledge that we're connected by many interrelated Aboriginal communities and that we are bound by this sacred landscape. We acknowledge that custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and the many places and spaces where we are spread across today has kept alive the relationships between all living things. We acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on our organisation's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. And with that, I also would like to start by introducing ourselves today. So hello, my name is Bonnie Dean and I'm from the University of Wollongong and I'm on the ACEN board directors. And we have the wonderful Professor Denise Jackson with us here today. And you can see Denise on the screen. Denise is the GOS lead for ACEN. So she really has been leading the charge and getting these WIL items inside this national survey, analysing this data and then interpreting that for what that means for us across Australia and across our organisations. This webinar will be recorded and that recording will be placed on the ACEN website in the coming week. I'm so excited to say that we had over 260 registrations. So if for some reason you weren't able to make the webinar today, you're probably then watching this as a recording. And we're so excited that this webinar piqued so much interest around Australia. That's fantastic. So as a Zoom webinar, your video and audio is currently turned off. So it's okay, we can't see or hear you. However, the chat is open and the Q&A is open. So if you do have a question or even a comment or something that you would like to share, please go ahead and write into those two spaces. We aim to go for about 45 minutes today. And at the end, we will do some questions and we'll address any thoughts or insights that you have at that time. Okay, so as an overview of the webinar itself, this is how the webinar will be structured. We're going to start with a brief background on the ACEN GOS items. So that will help give you a bit of an understanding of where the data and the findings are coming from today. The findings we've organised into 4 different sections. So the first 2, we're going to focus on employment, the impact of WIL on employment outcomes and perceived overqualification. And the second 2, we're going to look at perceived employability. So that's the impact of WIL on graduates' perceptions of their preparedness for work and graduates' perceptions on their perceived employability. And we've got 4 items which we'll look at there. We're going to wrap up with some key takeaways and some stakeholder implications. So we're so excited that you've joined us. Denise, it's over to you.
Thanks, Bonnie, and hi, everyone. Just a heads up, it's my first day out of isolation today and I have got a bit of a cough, I'm afraid. So hopefully it doesn't rear its head during the presentation. Quick background to the ACEN funded items. We've covered this already in previous webinars. As Bonnie mentioned, we've been running the items now for 2 years. There's 3 rounds of data collection and we had 30 participating members in 2020 and then 31 in 2021. And you can see the sample size changes really depending on the items that we're working with in terms of which graduates responded to which. But roughly there's around 75,000 graduates across the 2 years for the items that we're looking at today. So there are the items there that appear in the GOS. We're not looking at participation in WIL today, but as you can see, there are 3 different types: your work-based, your WIL that's not in the workplace, and global WIL. We will be looking, as Bonnie mentioned, this is looking at employment outcomes, and this is ACEN's measure for employment outcomes from participating in WIL. We won't be covering the not for academic credit or the co-curricular employability related activities today. And participation in paid work, we will be touching on that during the webinar. And then we have the influence of WIL on employment outcomes, which is really around, well, that's the broader measures, I guess, within the GOS. In terms, so just moving on to the findings, we'll look at the influence of WIL on employment outcomes, first of all. So these are our measures that we have within the ACEN items. And as you can see down here, we have whether WIL influence whether a graduate secured employment because of the experience that they gained during WIL. Whether they secured employment with their WIL industry, their actual WIL industry partner, or whether they secured employment through a network of contact they made during their WIL experience. So those are obviously all positive outcomes in terms of the influence of WIL and of differing degree. And then this is an other, which we don't gain more information on exactly how, but there's an other option there. And then if there was none of these, you can see those marked here. So the results, these are for 2021 only, and these data are actually presented in the member summary report, which is up available on the website, and very similar results to 2020. You can see here that around 1/4 secured employment because of their WIL experience, around 15%, and this is looking at the totals here. You've got the different course levels separated in the different colours. About 15% secured employment through their actual partner and around 10% through a network contact. And then you've got your other. So it's around just under half of all graduates that participated in WIL had some kind of positive employment outcome that they've declared in the survey from the WIL experience, which I guess a question for you to consider, is that what you expected? Did you expect it to be higher than that? When we look at this graph initially and we see these, what look like quite high bars here in terms of none of these, our first impression is perhaps that it's not very positive. But when you consider it that nearly half of graduates who participate in WIL reported a positive outcome, and remembering that the GOS takes place 4 to 6 months post-graduation, so there's still time for that WIL experience to have its positive effect, then some might consider these results fairly positive. Moving on to the measures for employment that sit within the larger GOS survey itself. So as I'm sure you're aware, there is a measure for full-time employment. This is for domestic graduates who are available for full-time work and manage to secure a full-time job. So we're presenting here data for 2020 and 2021, and we're looking at the different types of WIL. So this is if they did any WIL at all: work-based WIL, non-workplace WIL, global, and no WIL at all. So essentially, we want the percentage to be as high as possible. This is those that wanted to get a full-time job and managed to get a full-time job 4 to 6 months post-graduation. This is when they're making that declaration of employment. And you've got the 3 different course levels here. So if we focus on the bachelor graduates, you can see that yet again, there is a positive result for participating in any form of WIL. Last year, 70% of those that did any kind of WIL got a full-time job. This year, 71.7%, compared to in the previous year, 63.5%, and this year, 63.7%. So you can see there, you've got an 8% percentage difference between those that did WIL and those that didn't do WIL. And then looking across here, okay, so in terms of which type of WIL had the most effect, you can see here that it's work-based WIL followed by global WIL. In fact, the non-workplace WIL didn't seem to have a great effect in terms of the impact on full-time employment among bachelor graduates anyway. Looking at postgraduate coursework, this echoes the results from last year, where there's actually what seems like a negative impact from participating in WIL. So you can see here, 82.1% of those that participated in any WIL secured a full-time job, compared to 85% of those that didn't do WIL. And you might be thinking at this point, okay, how can that be? Possibly, one possible explanation might be that those that weren't in work already during their studies were the ones that opted to do WIL. And those that were in work already, that work transitioned straight through into full-time employment post-graduation, hence the higher percentage that we're seeing here. In terms of differences across the different types of will, you can see here that global will, interestingly, has a greater effect or a greater positive effect, while the other two forms of will is fairly marginal. In terms of postgraduate research, last year there wasn't a will effect for want of a different expression, but this year we can see a positive impact. So 83.2% of those that are available for full-time work managed to secure a full-time job, compared with 76.9% of those that didn't do any will of any kind. It is important to flag here the sample size. You can see the numbers for postgraduate research are lower. And I think with all the additional funding under the research training program, and also possibly people or universities focusing on introducing HDR internships as part of NPIL, we might see bigger numbers here in future years. So it'll be interesting to revisit this data and see how this changes over the years. It's, I think, important to note here, you can see for global will quite a high percentage there, but again, just flagging the sample size. The next slide is focused on the same data, but this is combining 2020 and 2021. And we've just presented it in a chart, really, for those of you that kind of can digest a chart more easily than a table. And really, you can see that it's just reinforcing the same messages from the previous slide here. Looking at, you've got your three different levels. So obviously you've got your darker orange is your bachelor, you've got in grey your postgraduate coursework and your postgraduate research. At bachelor level, we're seeing, when you look here, you're seeing the value of your work-based will and your global will really coming through there compared to the non-workplace will. In terms of your postgraduate coursework, there's really not a great deal of difference apart from possibly for your global will, which is really sitting at the same as those that didn't do any form of will. But then for your postgraduate research, we can see here the global will, the role of that, and also for your work-based will as well. I mentioned earlier about the measure for whether graduates declare in the ACEN items whether they worked during their studies. Now, we didn't explore this data these data in the webinars last year, but we wanted to look at whether this had an impact on the effective will. So it's important to note right from the outset that the question that we asked the graduates about whether they worked, we asked them whether they engaged in these different types of work. However, we don't ask them when during the course. We don't ask them if they stayed with the same employer, for example, but we do break down to whether they worked on a full-time or a part-time basis and whether it was relevant to their career, the work that they undertook while they were studying. We also don't ask them how long they were in that period of work for as well. So just to throw that out there right from the start. But what we did, this is looking at bachelor graduates only. We looked at those that completed work-based will and those that didn't complete work-based will. And you can see here that those that didn't do work-based will, but that were working in full-time work relevant to their career during their studies, 92% of those achieved a full-time role. And those that did work-based will, only 89%. So, not a great deal of difference, but you can see that work-based will, participating in that, didn't have a positive effect for those particular cohort of graduates. Those that worked in relevant roles but on a part-time basis, you can see a positive effect of will, although it's fairly marginal. However, where we can really see the difference here is when we move down the table. Again, not for those that are in full-time work, not relevant to their career, but for those that are working in part-time work or other is contract work or no work at all, that's where we can really see the positive effect of will kicking in. And you can see the difference in percentage points there. We're looking at around 14%, 15% for those here. I mean, that's one effect that we can see. The other one, when we take WIL out of the picture, we can see the actual, also the positive effect of working during studies on graduate outcomes. I mean, those that weren't working have a far lower proportion of those that secured a full-time role. Remembering these are graduates that are available for full-time work compared to those that are already working. And, a likely explanation is, yes, it could be because of the experience that they've got on their resumes, but it also could be that they transition from their full-time role straight into employment post-studies. And remembering that this survey is completed at 4 to 6 months, they might be in the same job. But we felt that that was interesting because we haven't really looked at that kind of interaction between paid work and work-based WIL previously. Moving on to looking at the impact of WIL on perceived overqualification. So as we've mentioned in earlier seminars, webinars, we've looked at perceived overqualification is measured by the SPOC scale, which is 8 items, which essentially ask graduates to consider whether they're utilising their skills and utilising the course content that they learn in their studies. And is their work that they're in relevant, or, is it relevant or related to the course that the studies that they undertook? These are these items or the data that you're going to see now is for domestic bachelor graduates, and those are working in full-time roles. So presenting it in table format again, and you can see the separation of 20 and 21. Basically, the GOS, what happens, they take the 8 items, they look at whether 6 of those items, there are valid responses, and then they use an algorithm to calculate whether a graduate perceives themselves to be overqualified or not. And obviously we want, we want a small proportion of graduates to feel overqualified. So we want the percentage to be as low as possible here. So this table really highlights the positive effect of WIL, and it's the same as last year when we presented the webinar. We have the same story, even more so than securing full-time work. WIL seems to provide great support for helping graduates receive relevant graduate level employment. So you've got here at the bachelor level, graduates who did any form of WIL during their studies, only 24.2% felt that they were overqualified. When I say only there, we have to take a step back and think that's still nearly a quarter, but it is obviously a far lower percentage compared to those that didn't do any form of WIL at all, which is sitting at 38%. These are all fairly similar to last year. In terms of which type of WIL seemed to have the greatest effect, we can see here that work-based WIL really was the one that seemed to really feed into this low figure here. So only 22% of those that did work-based WIL felt that they were in a role that wasn't, didn't match essentially their degree compared to the other forms of WIL here. In terms of postgraduate of the coursework level, so you can see here again we've got a positive effect. We have 22.6% of postgraduates compared to 34%, and this is looking at the in terms of any form of WIL. And then when we look at the different levels here, so we have work-based, which again gives very positive results. And then you've got non-workplace here and global WIL. But this again, work-based WIL seems to be the one that's creating the biggest impact here. In terms of postgraduates at the research level, same story, but this less effect compared to the bachelor level, but still you can see the difference here. This is an interesting one. I did go back and check the figures on this, and they are correct. Those that undertook non-workplace WIL had a very low proportion felt that they were overqualified for their role. But again, we need to note the sample size. There's only 63 graduates responding here. But even so of interest, and actually global WIL as well is, it seems to be having a positive effect there. So similar to the full-time employment outcomes, we've merged the data. This is 2020 and 2021 and presented graphically for you. And here really, we can see that in terms of you can see the positive impact of work-based WIL. Just looking at that as a snapshot compared with those that didn't complete WIL, you can see that you've got far lower proportions there. And at the bachelor level, we can see again, there's that massive difference there between 38% and then the different forms of will, all which seem to have a reasonably positive effect there. Moving on, we wanted to also look at the impact or the interaction, I suppose, between work-based will and paid work. So exactly the same as before, this is for graduates, bachelor graduates, both years, and that are working in full-time roles. And again, we want this percentage to be as low as possible. So these are those that are feeling that they're overqualified in their role. Interestingly here, WIL seems to have a positive effect irrespective of the type of work they're doing, whether it's full-time or whether it's relevant to their career. So you can see here that 21.8% of those that were employed, as a graduate, felt that they were overqualified compared to those 30%. And these were ones that worked in a full-time role that was considered relevant to their career during their studies. Again, we don't know how long that they did work for, whether it's in their first year, third year, or both, etc. And then moving down the table, you can see some of the differences here. Broadly, you can see that working in a job that's relevant to your career seems to have a positive effect anyway in terms of your employment outcomes, but even more so if you also undertake work-based will at the same time. And you can see here those that didn't do any work and that didn't undertake will, 41%, that's high, considered themselves overqualified for their jobs. And actually not a dissimilar figure for those that were in part-time work as well. So some interesting figures here. This one as well jumps out. That's extremely high. It might be perhaps, so those who are working full-time during their degree, not relevant employment. It could be again flagging that this survey is undertaken at 4 to 6 months post-graduation. Perhaps those graduates are still in the same roles when they completed the survey. Okay, so moving on, still with the overqualification theme, and we did look at this last year as well. This is bachelor level. This is 2020 and 2021 combined. I know this is small. You've got a range of different disciplines here. There's around 20 different discipline areas. I will just flag right from the outset that tourism and hospitality has very small numbers in here. But what we've done is we've looked, this is looking again at perceived overqualification. The dark bar shows, the dark proportion shows those that completed will, and the pale bar shows, or part of section of the bar shows that those that didn't complete will. And broadly, as you can see across here, the dark bar is smaller than the pale bar, which is a positive result again, and that really just supports the previous findings, but it gives you a bit of an idea about the different disciplines. What I'm going to do is just proceed to the next slide. And we did the same as we did this last time. We took a step back and went, okay, looking at these disciplines, which are the ones that we generally know they have mandatory will in them. So it's just, integral to the course. And that would be these over here in blue. Whereas these, and again, this, some people we recognize that these discipline areas are quite big and they might have disciplines within them that do have mandatory will, but broadly we would say that these are more likely to have elective will incorporated into the degree rather than mandatory will. You can see here straight away that perceived overqualification is higher among those that those disciplines where generally will is elective rather than mandatory. So that is quite striking when we divide or when we organize the graph this way. The other thing which has to be noted, and this really is around the survey, the item design, is that if this is mandatory will, and let's look at nursing, and we all know that nursing has mandatory, has practicum integrated, as does engineering with their, or not practicum integrated, but they have their required hours. Why are we even seeing anything here for no will? And this raises a good question, which we recognised, the board recognised and worked through last year. When we ask graduates to say whether they participate in will, we asked them originally for 2020 and 2021, did you undertake will for academic credits? And you can see here that some of these disciplines, they should have said yes, but they didn't. They said no, which is why you've got the pale blue bars here. We have changed the wording for this year to say as part of your course rather than for academic credit. So that is an important thing to note. So we might see a slightly different story here next year when we work through this data. But either way, you can still, you can see that overqualification is generally higher among these disciplines. In terms of the orange areas, where WIL seemed to have its biggest impact was in science and mathematics, also humanities, culture and social sciences, and also in psychology. These slides will be, and the recording will obviously be available. So you can, you might, depending on your discipline area, you might want to dig down further into these, but we'll have a closer review. But I guess this does highlight that there are differences by discipline and the importance of drilling down into that data, which is quite possible now with 2 years worth of data at bachelor level. It gets more tricky with a postgraduate level with the smaller sample. Okay, enough talking from me, and over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Denise. So yes, these slides and the recordings will be made available, absolutely. So please give us about a week and then we will make sure that we circulate those to all of you who registered for the webinar today, and we'll also have them available on the ACEN website. All right, we've been talking about employment. Now we're going to talk about perceived employability. So to begin with, what we did was we asked full-time employed graduates, so that's 4 to 6 months after they've graduated, we asked them overall, how well did your qualification prepare you for your job? And we're looking at a Likert scale here. So the table on the next slide there, thanks Denise. Now this shows the proportion of graduates who rated well or very well to the following types of work integrated learning. So you will see graduates across all levels who participated in any WIL reported overall higher levels here qualifications of perceived preparedness. So what I want to do is just highlight here undergraduate first of all, because it's quite striking here. So if you look at undergraduate in 2021, it's 80.6% here, compared to those who participated in no WIL for 2021, and that's 66.4%. So look, these are quite high numbers, but also noting that for undergraduate responses, there were quite high number of responses there compared to the other types of degrees. Then just take a note between the any WIL and no WIL, looking at 2020 to 2021. Now we note those who responded to perceived preparedness for employment in 2020 participated in WIL in 2019. And those who responded to the survey in 2021 would have experienced their WIL possibly in 2020. And we know what happened in 2020. So we're just keeping in mind that there may have been some differences and interruptions there. But even considering this, the statistics here aren't too different. So between undergraduate, we're looking at 2020 and 2021 for any WIL, there's only about a 3% difference there. Going over to no WIL, it's a little bit bigger, about a 4% between 70 and 66. Now, if we go on to postgraduate work, again, we've got quite high numbers here as well. We're looking at 83.4% for any type of WIL, and you go over to no WIL, and that's 70.2%. So again, we're seeing quite a significant difference here between those participating in any WIL and their perceived preparedness compared to those who did not participate in WIL and their perceived preparedness for employment. Postgraduate research is actually a little bit higher, and that's quite interesting as well. That's postgraduate those who undertook, say, a thesis or a research project, and that's 87% for participating in any WIL for 2021 and 80% for those who did not participate in WIL. So that's actually quite high for that one as well. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is a similar representation, but what we've done here is actually broken it down into the disciplines for those who participated across all types of work integrated learning. So the slides will be available, so apologies if you can't read the fine text here. So So overall, there are 10 disciplines presented here due to sample size, and we can see some variation between the disciplines. Yet broadly, the highest you will see in the middle there is actually health and education. Now, this is where WIL is embedded and interwoven as part of the course, and so we do expect to see a higher percentage here of graduates indicating their perceived preparedness. For society and culture, which is just a little bit further over, there is quite a stark difference between those who participated in any sort of WIL compared to those who participated in no WIL. So no WIL is actually the green bar. So you can see for society and culture, which is the second column on the right, there is quite a significant difference there. Overall, though, you will see that the green bar is slightly smaller, again, indicating that those who participated in types of WIL and any types of WIL as well have higher perceived levels of employment across the years. Okay, next slide. What we wanted to do as well is look at the impact of WIL overall on perceived employability. And we wanted to do this drilling down into the different types of employability that are indicated in the GOS. You may recall this from a previous webinar that we've had, but just to refresh, as was mentioned earlier in the webinar, down the bottom you will see the items there saying, reflecting on my professional capabilities for improved job prospects, my awareness of other organisations where I could work, my appeal in the labour market, and my contact network, improved job prospects. So again, we're asking graduates to respond to the degree to which they feel like they're participating in WIL actually helped improve these areas of their employability. So as you will see, the highest level here is actually my professional capabilities, and that's across all degrees. So the undergraduate, postgraduate coursework, and as well as postgraduate research. Interestingly, postgraduate research comes out really high here as well for professional capabilities. So that's graduates indicating how well they feel prepared. My appeal in the labour market drops significantly, especially for undergraduate students here, these who participated in any types of WIL. And my contact network is also quite low for undergraduate and postgraduate in comparison to, say, postgraduate research, which was a lot higher, and that one there is actually sitting at 75.4%. So look, overall, this is a really good news story as well for perceived employability for those who participated in work integrated learning. It is interesting though that my contact network improved is one of the lower ones, indicating those those industry contacts that students engage with during their degree, as well as my appeal in the labour market as well. So I think we need to do some reflecting on why those two perceptions of their employability may be slightly lower compared to, say, my professional capabilities. Okay, and the next one. What we're doing here is just looking at bachelor graduates, so those who completed an undergraduate. For this one, we're looking across both years, so from 2020 and 2021, and we're looking at across all types of WIL, the 3 types of WIL, so work-based WIL, non-workplace WIL, and global WIL. So for those bachelor graduates from say 2021, so the most recent intake of data, professional capabilities for improved job prospects, similarly as what we've seen before, quite high. So if we're looking at those that are coloured red, if you look across professional capabilities, so for work-based WIL, it's 82%, and in 2020 it was 83%, so it's only just a small drop there. But global WIL is really high again, right up there with work-based WIL. So in 2021, 82.4%, and for 2020, slightly higher, 83.5%. Looking into the non-workplace WIL column, look, these are still really high statistics in the 70s, so 74 and 77, but we do note that the other types of WIL, work-based and global WIL, are higher percentages here. Now, if you look at the other 3 types of perceived employability, we see that there is smaller percentages, smaller indications here around perceived employability. Particularly, I wanted to highlight non-workplace WIL. So you can see that one on the second column cluster. And the final element around perceived employability, which is improved contact network for job prospects. And that at the moment for the past round, which is 2021 graduates, is sitting at 51.5%. So that means those who participated in a non-workplace WIL opportunity, only 51.5% indicated that they had an improved network, contact network for improved job prospects. And look, we can certainly have some conversations around what you think that might mean. Denise and I have had a bit of a conversation, and the board as well. We seem to think that there really is indications here that those who participate in non-workplace WIL, look, overall don't get as much access to industry personnel as those who are more immersed in placements or internships such as work-based WIL, or those who have broader global WIL experiences. But, we would really love to hear your thoughts and insights on what you think that might mean as well. Okay, next one. What we're doing here is moving to the next degree. So here we're looking at postgraduate coursework. There aren't as many significant differences, but there are certainly still shifts and changes as compared to the undergraduate degree. Again, interestingly, professional capabilities is coming quite high. Not a huge lot of movement between workplace WIL, which is 84.9% for 2020 and 83.1% for 2021. But global WIL has a bit more of a difference there for perceived professional capabilities and job prospects. If you go to non-workplace WIL, I don't think I've highlighted that one red, but you can actually see once again, similar to undergraduate, the non-workplace WIL and contact network for improved job prospects is on the lower end compared to the other elements of employability there. So at 56.5% for 2021 and 58% for 2020. So again, small differences between the 2 years, but not huge leaps or jumps. And finally, the next one relates to postgraduate research, which is the next slide there. And quite consistent findings here across the years as well. So, and as we mentioned before, quite high for professional capabilities, once again, for postgraduate research. Interestingly, for global WIL, I just want to point out the far right column there, which is 89.1%, which is that those graduates of postgraduate research indicated in this past year, in the 2021, that their global WIL experience really prepared them for their employment based on their professional capabilities. They really, so that's quite a high jump as well from 2020, from an 86 up to 89. So it's really nice to actually see that there's some increase there around those global WIL opportunities, but overall it's still quite high for professional capabilities. If we look at non-workplace WIL, the numbers are actually quite higher here as well. In the previous 2 degrees, we were looking at around the 50s, and here we are in non-workplace WIL, looking around there's a 60 there and up through to the 80s as well. And for improved network and networks for job prospects, we're looking at 70s there rather than 50s. Okay, and the next slide. And this is all graduates, so I won't labour on this one too much because you've seen it all before. Definitely higher numbers for professional capabilities. For those of you who are visual learners and prefer to see this visually, this is just another representation of the tables that we've just gone through in detail. What is circled there in orange is my professional capabilities for improved job prospects. So you can just see now just how much higher those who participated in these different types of WIL really felt like WIL was related to enhancing their professional capabilities. Okay. And that wraps up our findings. What we're doing now is we're going to shift into some key takeaways. Now, these are the things that Denise and I have sort of put our minds together and read through the data and the findings and thought, these are the things that for us are really stark or things that are interesting. But again, as you're looking through the data today and as you reflect on it in your own time afterwards through this recording or the slides, we'd also really love to hear what your thoughts are and what you think the data is telling us as well. Okay, so let's look at employability first. So WIL and employability, look, overall, there is largely consistent findings across the 2 years. So we're looking at the 2020 and the 2021. We do notice in some aspects around perceived employability, there are some decreases. recalling that those who responded to the survey in 2021 would have participated in WIL in 2020. So, but overall, this is a good news WIL story, once again, where WIL activities are shown to enhance the perceptions of preparedness for future employment. So this is a really good thing. All forms of WIL were valued. So that was the three forms that we noticed: work-based, non-work-based, and global. However, there are noticeable differences for disciplines. So please, we encourage you to go back and take a look at those disciplines that you are related to or that you sit within. We really see that WIL is useful for developing professional capabilities. Again, that's what the data is telling us. But there's also scope to improve the impact of WIL on network development and perceptions of labour market appeal. Now, this is where I think there really needs to be a closer relationship between career development learning and work integrated learning. Perhaps it is that we need to start really thinking about the types of reflective and career related prompts that we're giving students throughout their WIL opportunities, so that they have those opportunities to really think through what is my labour market appeal, and also providing those opportunities to think about who are my networks, where are my networks, and that all relates to that career development learning. And finally, not all forms of WIL have the same effect on graduates' perceptions of their own employability. This relates to the types of WIL that are taking place that aren't in the workplace, and we can see that there is a difference between work-based WIL and global WIL, which seem to be really coming out on top in this particular round of data as well. It's really obvious that work-based WIL and global WIL are seen as having really positive impacts. And then non-workplace WIL is having a good impact, but definitely smaller than the other two types of WIL. Again, they're our findings, so we'd love to hear from you. Please put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A. Denise, I'll hand to you to have some reflections on the employment aspect.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, so in terms of the employment, a quick summary. So WIL, particularly work-based, has a clear positive effect on full-time graduate employment at the bachelor level. We didn't see that reiterated for postgraduates at coursework level, but we did see it for postgraduate research. And it will be interesting, as we mentioned earlier, as the numbers increase of HDR students participating in internships, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that data. In terms of the type of WIL that's the greatest value to bachelor graduates, in terms of the work they completed to their studies, sorry, that didn't make any sense. I'm going to start again. Work-based WIL of greatest value to the bachelor graduates who did not undertake full-time or relevant work. So looking at that interaction effect that we introduced this year, just those that aren't working at all, or that working in roles that aren't relevant, or that are undertaking full-time work that's not relevant, you can really see the positive effect of WIL coming through there, and less so for others. Same story as last year, perceived overqualification. WIL has a positive effect at all course levels, and we've seen that for 2 years in a row now. And in terms of overqualification and work, paid work, rather than in terms of, we saw a difference with full-time, the impact of work-based WIL on full-time employment, and depending on how much they worked and the type of work they did, we didn't see that with overqualification. We saw a positive effect irrespective of the type of work that they undertook during their studies, albeit the magnitude was slightly different depending on the work that they did. And I guess the first opening slide that we had in terms of the 45% had some kind of impact on their employment outcomes using the ACEN measures, compared to the 55% which said no, nothing at all. Arguably you could conclude that when we actually dig down into the GOS, the standard items on employment destinations, the picture is perhaps more favourable than when you first conclude looking at that first slide. So in terms of wrapping, all of this together and implications to practitioners and policy, based on the data that we've shown today, across the 2 years, there was consistency in the results. There's an argument there that can inform policy and practice. And as time goes on and we have more data to look at and more trends to analyse that hopefully will, continue and provide us with, where we can inform policy and practice in the WIL area and beyond, and employability more generally. That slide, in terms of a couple of slides in terms of discipline, does show that drilling down by discipline is important, and considering whether WIL is integral to the course or whether it's an elective component of the course. And that will get easier as time goes on, as we have more data to use, and then we can overcome the problem with sample size, which can be problematic in some some disciplines. As Bonnie highlighted, for the employability piece as well as the employment piece, certainly work-based and global WIL are, seem to be particularly useful in terms of enhancing graduate outcomes, and leveraging those where possible seems to be a positive move for institutions. In terms of non-workplace WIL and why it might not have the same level of effect, possibly we might look at the design of workplace WIL. I know in our own institution, and I'm sure in others, some are taking the view of, okay, you can either do that or you can do work-based WIL. And we do that for a good reason. We do it to cater to diverse cohorts. But I guess, we need to keep in mind that the outcomes are not the same across the different types of WIL. But there are probably things that you can introduce into a standard WIL unit or a WIL or a course, depending on where you are in the country, being that you can wrap all the career development learning side and possible and reflection, etc., into that WIL unit to try and make perhaps the effect more equitable across those different types. We saw from that snapshot about perceived overqualification and the difference between those disciplines where WIL is mandatory and where WIL is elective. We could see quite clearly the benefits of having mandatory WIL incorporated, and many of those disciplines it's interwoven from year one. So that tends to lead to lower levels of overqualification, perceived overqualification among graduates. We've spoken about this already, and I was looking at the Q&A section while Bonnie was speaking and saw the questions around, okay, what does this all mean though for the different groups of students that we have? So equity groups, also the international versus domestic, another one might be mature age. And interestingly, we're actually working on that right at the moment, and there will be a webinar that will be scheduled for next month, which will drill down into those things. So that's that's good news, because you can see that obviously people want some more information on that detail, and that really alludes to that last point. The targeted approach might apply by discipline, but it might also apply by the cohort of graduates that you're working with. We're on to questions, so I'll hand over to you, Bonnie.
Thanks so much, Denise. So we've got a range of questions in here, so I'll cover as many as we can. It was great that you've just addressed that question, Denise, about the different group cohorts. And so, yes, there is definitely a webinar that is coming up. We booked it in for the 16th of June, and that will look at different student cohorts and their responses to the GOS survey. Oh, please forgive me, I've got the garbage truck outside. It always comes at the worst time, doesn't it? Okay, some interesting questions have arisen. I want to start with Peter Garn's comment, and he says, the survey design seems to assume that respondents have discrete WIL experiences, exclusive in one form or another. This is really what we deliver to students. So students may have multiple WIL experiences over the course of the degree. So Denise, how does the GOS account for different WIL experiences?
Yeah, so when we see those figures that come up, it's not that they only participated in work-based WIL or only non-workplace WIL. There could be students that sit across those different groups there. So we're looking at that particular type of WIL, noting that they might have participated in multiple, which you could argue, yes, okay, that's relevant. And Bonnie and I actually did drill down and look at the impact on full-time employment, overqualification, on only if they'd participated in one type. We narrowed it down. That's actually, that paper has actually just come out in the Herd Journal. And that's not doing a shameless plug there. That's just answering the question. But and that was looking more at employability and perceived employability rather than employment outcomes. But yes, you're absolutely right. We recognise that the graduates participate in different forms of WIL. We haven't done any additional analysis at this stage of which disciplines, how many students are participating in multiple different types of WIL at discipline level. There's so much that can be done with the data, and you'll appreciate we're kind of, slogging through, trying to focus on different areas as we go. But certainly that will be something to drill down into at a later time.
Excellent. Thanks, Denise. So building on that, Narelle's offered a really interesting comment, and it says very interesting findings. It's the findings on network development indicate a need to more deliberately scaffold undergraduate students' capability to establish networks during work-based WIL. Seems like a golden opportunity is currently being missed. Denise, what are your thoughts on that idea of deliberately scaffolding WIL opportunities throughout a degree program?
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. And I think also if you've got cohorts that come in with perhaps less developed cultural capital and social capital. So if you have lots of students that are perhaps first in family and less professionally connected, I think trying to scaffold that from year one is really important because they might not understand the cultural cues of and I'm thinking, obviously I'm sitting in a business school, so I'm thinking, I guess, of corporate workplaces and the language of graduate employers, etc. But I do think there's a lot to be said about perhaps introducing bite-sized micro placements, lighter touch where you have industry engagement, might be through, for example, project-based WIL consulting, that type of thing, and then build it up to their more capstone experience where they're actually immersed into the workplace, and then they themselves feel prepared and ready to really leverage the opportunity. And we know it's a great opportunity that work-based WIL offers for those students.
Absolutely. So taking that course-wide approach, looking at a variety of types of WIL across the course and throughout the student's learning journey. Denise, we have just two clarifying questions here. The first one is, what constitutes global WIL?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the items that are presented to the graduates, so global WIL, they're asked, which of the following WIL activities, if any, did you complete as a core or elective part of your course? And the course is named. And global WIL, it has global WIL experience bracket, industry study tour, international internship, placement or service learning experience.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So those are available in the study as they're about to click on that item as they're responding to it. That's awesome. Another clarifying question is, how is my appeal in the labour market determined?
Yeah, and there's an example of a survey item being interpreted by the individual. So obviously, there can be bias there. The wording literally is thinking about the activities you completed. Please indicate the extent to which you agree or disagree with each of the following statements. The activities helped improve, and then it literally says my appeal in the labour market. I mean, so read into that how you would. I mean, my reading on that would be my appeal to graduate employers in terms of securing employment. But so we don't define that any further than as it's stated.
Absolutely. So Tom Worthington. Hi, Tom. Tom's from Canberra. Hi, Tom. Welcome. He offers a bit of a provocation here. So, is WIL beneficial, or is this a correlation? The good workers are selected for WIL, and then they're the ones who get jobs.
Yeah, I saw that, and I think that's a really important point, Tom. And that again comes down to the discussion that Dino had raised as well about, the students that are actually participating in WIL, in terms of those that are going in, and then the gain, I guess, when they're coming out as well. And we can look at that with the GOS data to a certain degree. We can look obviously at the different student groups. We are making some assumptions when we look at some of the different equity groups, or we look at domestic versus international, etc. We are making assumptions about that cohort and perhaps why their outcomes might not be as good, or why they didn't participate as much. But there's also an institution level, it's possible, and I've done this with our own institution, where you look at students that participate in certain WIL units by their WAM or their course average, for example, and you can compare their outcomes. That's absolutely possible for you to do with your own data. But at a GOS level with the data, sorry, at a national level with the data we have, I guess, yeah, the first step would be discipline and also their membership of different groups. That doesn't, that's a bit blunt, but based on their background characteristics.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I think from here, what we're doing as ACEN is really offering a bit of a broad brush, and we're drilling down into it as many of these items as we can to present to you some really interesting findings around what is happening with WIL in Australia right now. But please do certainly go to your institutional data if you can take a look at that and do your own analysis. It'd be really interesting for you to see what does this mean for our institution? What does that mean for my discipline? And then take a look at what we've presented here in terms of a national level. And that would be a really interesting point of reflection for you, for your discipline, and as well as for your institution. So we certainly do encourage this as just the first step in a range of conversations that we can certainly have around the GOS data. I think I'll leave the questions there for now. Denise, do you have any other final thoughts or closing comments?
No, just echoing what you said, Bonnie. All the institutions have the data. Really important to have a look at that. And obviously, as we're in our third year now, that data will be available at the end of the year. And hopefully, with all our members' support, we can keep on gathering the data and then keep on providing you with snapshots of different areas for you to then consider to inform your own policy and practice, and perhaps guide on areas that you might want to drill down into.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much to everybody who is participating today all around Australia. Thanks for tuning in and spending the last hour with us. We really appreciate it. Just reiterating, this recording will be available on the ACEN website as well as the slides, and we will make sure we will send you an email to all those who registered so that you have access to that as soon as it is available. Just give us about a week. Okay, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for your participation. We do have an equity and GOS, which is our different student groups, coming up on the 16th of June, and we'll get that out to you, some advertising around that shortly as well. We have another ACEN Critical Conversations also coming up this May, so please go to the ACEN website, check out what's going on in terms of our events, and reach out if you've got any further comments or questions. That's it from us. Thanks so much,
everyone.
everybody.
Have a good day.
Bye.